SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello students, we will continue our study of modern Indian architecture, and today we will be starting with a series called the first generation from 1945 to 1970. We have already seen a transition of architecture from pre-independence to post-independence, and in that what we have studied thus far is how architecture started evolving from Art Deco to modernism, because modernism had already established firm roots in Europe and America, and it was now moving to other parts of the world, and India was a part of the global impact of modernism. We had, for example, seen modernism and its relationship to tropical architecture with the example of Golconda by Antonin Raymond, and so modernism, that is modified to suit India's climate and construction processes. This is a very important strand in the development of modernism in India, because we will continue to see that all the way into the 21st century. We also looked at revivalist architecture with the examples of Vidhan, Sauda, etc., and minimalism as it appeared in a vernacular form in Sabarmati Ashram. We had also seen the example of Shantiniketan, which was more of a revivalist style, but it had also an eclectic mix of neoclassical features as well as traditional Indian features. Now, starting with this series today, we go back again to the time of India's independence. There are 2 or 3 watershed moments in India's history. We are relating these 2-3 moments vis-a-vis architecture. One, of course, is the independence. 1947, India becomes independent. Then we have the second watershed moment that happened around 1991 with liberalization. So these 2 very fundamental moments brought about a paradigm shift in architecture. I wouldn't say that it was a complete changeover, but there was a major awareness that something fundamental had changed in India. Changes that had begun in pre-independent times gathered momentum post-independence. Now, independence brought a range of problems, opportunities, expectations and dreams in front of an independent India with a very young population. But on the other side was the tremendous tragedy of the partition that caused an immense refugee problem involving millions of families coming into the country. And the aftermath of the partition was that millions of people had to be resettled all over Punjab, Delhi and West Bengal, and there was hectic building activity. And the initial days there was no time for detailed building plans, and again the crash building program was undertaken by the public sector, predominantly in the CPWD, using readily available materials, and there was a number of small buildings or the number of small towns and resettlement colonies that came up in many parts of India. For example, we have in Nizamuddin a resettlement colony. So in Nizamuddin we have resettlement colony coming up, and then smaller towns, other parts of India post independence. The role of CPWD at this time was critical because it was a part of the central government, under central government control, so had a very wide role to play in providing one of the most immediate requirement, and that was for housing. It struggled with many limitations and supply problems in trying to restore a sense of confidence to millions through both provision of housing as well as services. And all this was achieved not by a very great machinery of engineers and architects, a machinery of engineers, but only a handful of architects employed by the government. And at independence, if you want to see how minuscule this number was, it was only around one architect per 1 million people or 10 lakh people versus one for every 4,000 in Britain. And Mumbai had half of these India's about 300 architects at the time of independence. And just as architects began to understand the challenges that were lying ahead, one old debate erupted again, and that was with regard to style. We'd already seen this kind of argument being brought in front of us through the Indo-Sasanic style or the colonial style, and different people trying to develop architecture using these different formats. And so the debate about style post-independence, just as before independence, it was how much style indigenization could the British do without making wide political concessions to a subject people. Post-independence, it was how much style indigenization could an independent India do without appearing backward or weak to the world. That means we do go back and we do try to Indianize modern architecture, that which we were getting from the West, but in doing so we should not make it an architecture which was regressive, but it had to be an architecture that was progressive. Now in some cases the modernist model was implemented as is, for example in the works of Habib Rahman, and in certain cases it underwent a modification in the works of, for example, the CPWD. The other strand was that which we saw last time, that was nationalism, a widespread sentiment at freedom, and that was to be expressed or sought to be expressed through revivalism in architecture, as we saw in the Vidhan Sauda. And building styles from colonialism to modernism were perceived as foreign and hence anti-national. So whether it was the work of Walter Sykes George, whether it was the work of Antonin Raymond, modernist, the Golconda Ashram, these were not, they were thought to be foreign to India, and what styles or what architecture was Indian was, for example, traditional temple architecture, historical temple architecture, and this kind of derivation. So prominent political leaders supported revivalism, and revivalists sought to reach back 1,000 years for architectural forms and details which symbolized various historical periods of India. And on the other hand, the modernist argument was that architecture should be viewed in the context of its times, it should not be imitated. So whether it was the Premabai Hall by B.V. Doshi, whether it was the WHO building by Habib Rahman or Corbusier's work in Chandigarh, modern India required modern architectural symbols and forms for modern buildings or even modern monuments to express the march of free India towards economic development. So these are some of the modern iconic buildings of a modern India, derived predominantly from modernist architecture. So we have Institute of Indology by B.V. Doshi, we have the LIC building in Delhi by Charles Correa, we had the Hall of Nations in Pragati Maidan by Raj Rewal. This building, it's by Kuldeep Singh in Janpath, and the STC building by Raj Rewal again in Connaught Place. Besides this, the library building or the entire campus of IIT Kanpur, this building by Shivnath Prasad, and then the works of CPWD and the work at IIT Delhi, all modern buildings derived from modernist architecture. But in this we will go and see that later on that different strands developed over time. Now the result of partition also was the immediate need to, in post-independent India, for two state capitals of Punjab and Odisha, because of the process of boundary adjustment between the different states of India. And so we have modernists who gained the support of Jawaharlal Nehru and invited Corbusier and Otto Konigsberger to India for designing these cities. Königsberger, on the recommendation of the CM of Odisha at that time, he went in for a revivalist model in Bhubaneswar, whereas Corbusier went in for modernism in Chandigarh. Königsberger had been brought in with the idea of modernism, but he modified his impact, or rather this modernist style in Bhubaneswar by maintaining a balance between the old and new towns. And both Königsberger and his associate Julius Vaz, the structures had temple-like tops. We had it in this particular building in the main market of Bhubaneswar, and we had it in this public building called the Rabendra Mandap. So this form at the top, though not a direct derivation from a temple form, or not so evident as we saw it, for example, in the Vidhan Sauda, or we saw the Shikhara in the Banaras Hindu University, which was very direct imitation of those forms, Shikhara in BHU and the Vimana in the Vidhan Sauda. In this case, it was a derivation, it was an interpretation of the temple form. We will again go back to a series called Western Architects in India, and we will look at these works in detail, particularly the impact of Corbusier. Now, to digress a little bit and look at a reflection that Indian Institute of Architects IIA was established in 1917, and Indian architectural found its feet in the 1920s. So the series we saw last time was from 1920 to 1950. But these architects were really designing a very tiny fraction of designed built environment. Most buildings were being designed and executed by the mistris or masons, but though it may sound as a disadvantage to the architects, one thing was still true, that the mistris were also being influenced by the architects to adopt new modes of construction and management. So even if the bulk of the built environment was still being designed and executed by the masons or the mistris, they were also being impacted by the changing architectural scene. One aspect that was right at the outset, like for example, this time also I told you that one of the critical requirement was for housing. So massive housing programs due to the influx of refugees after partition, and also because of increasing population. And in this context, modern architecture really took off in India. Now, when the British left India, they had left behind an unfinished canvas for us to reimagine and render in the style that we wanted it to be. The canvas they left behind, for example, the Victoria Memorial in Kolkata, or the India Gate, or the Central Secretariat, what was going to be our response? How were we going to complete the canvas is the entire story of modern Indian architecture. Now, just to give you a glimpse of the architectural background, at independence, the departure of British engineers and architects, so the Indian professionals took over the major firms and leaderships in the public works departments, but in the short term there was little change in architecture as a result of this shift in the leadership positions in these firms and in these departments, because these new leaders had also been trained under Claude Batley and they were firmly under his influence. He had a very dominant role to play, not only in the architectural scene at that time, but also in education, because he was heading Sir J.J. School of Architecture and Art. So the major Indian architects were either educated under Batley at Sir J.J. or they had worked in Gregson, Batley and King, which was like a PG design school. The firm itself was like a postgraduate design school for Indian architects. So both the school and the firm, both headed by Claude Batley, the concern was to produce an architecture that was modern, that had symbolic references to India, and that was suitable for the existing way of life and also to the climatic conditions of India. In that sense, Claude Batley was very sensitive to what India needed. So the buildings that were produced with him in charge was had traditional Indian elements, there was Art Deco, and there were modernist tendencies. Now, established private firms are also responsible for emerging professionally designed built environment. We saw one firm a couple of times, last time was that of Billardi, Thompson and Matthew, and Lady Dufferin Hospital and other buildings, for example IIT Kanpur, the main building, were designed by them, as well as that of GBK. Along with that, the public works departments also played a major role in shaping the physical environment of early post-independence India. One of the people who really played a critical role in raising the level of design in the CPWD was Habib Rahman, who joined CPWD post-independence, having studied in the United States, and he gave a totally new direction to the works of CPWD. CPWD was also responsible for the design of Bhubaneswar, that is designed by the Odisha PWD, and Vidhan Sauda in Bangalore. These are examples that show the various directions that were taken by the PWDs. Now, if you look at CPWD and the designing for Delhi, New Delhi, the first Indian head of CPWD was GB Deolalekar, and the second Indian head, who was, so to speak, a graduate of GBK, was SK Joglekar. Now, it was required of them to build around Rajpath the new administration and institutional buildings for an expanding Indian government. So, along this entire axis that you see here, this had to be populated with these buildings required for the Indian government. Now, the predicament was that the design set by Lutyens and Baker, it was a very strong urban design and had very strong architectural precedents. It was completely overshadowing anything else that was going to, it would have overshadowed anything else that would have come up in this belt. Now, the modernist position was that precedents are largely irrelevant and should not be heeded in urban design and city development. For example, when Corbusier designed the Carpenter Center in Harvard in 1960, when he was placing the building, he gave it, so to speak, an inclined axis on the site, and thus not only that, the form itself of the building had a curvilinear feature in it, and it was an opposition to the existing order, which was regarded as a prerequisite for creative design in modernism. So, we see that happening repeatedly in modernism and then onwards in late modernism. We see that in the way Seagram building was planned by Mies van der Rohe in New York, by giving that vast open avenue plaza in front of the skyscraper, which was a completely novel concept in New York. It was in the high-tech building, the Centre Pompidou, designed by Richard Rogers and Renzo Piano, or the Lloyds of London by Richard Rogers later on in London, and these buildings were showing opposition to an existing order. Seagram, an opposition to the existing order of the wedding cake or the setback skyscrapers in New York, by setting the entire building back and raising it up as a single glass and steel block on a plaza. Very elegant solution that in fact brought in a change in the zoning resolutions of New York in 1961 because of this building and the one adjacent to it, that is the Liver House by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. Now, these two buildings, Centre Pompidou in Paris and Lloyds in London, were in stark contrast to the architecture and urban design all around these buildings. But CPWD did not do that. They decided to build to the existing order, and therefore the imperial style of Lutyens and Baker, according to them, was worth repeating. They did not go ahead with this break of the existing, or rather in opposition to the existing order as seen in Carpenter Center, but they rather went in with the strong urban design vocabulary of Lutyens Delhi. So, this is what happened. The goal was to develop the area in and around Rajpath to fit the architecture of Lutyens and Baker without being same. So, we have these buildings coming up. This is the Rajpath, the axis down from Rashtrapati Bhavan, the two secretariat buildings on either side, and this entire built form very much in symmetry, very much in alignment to the axis in terms of urban design, and the forms themselves being replicated in twos, identical on either side. So if the secretariat buildings on both sides were identical, so are these two buildings and so are these two buildings. So not only is the identity correlation with the overall urban design form, but even in the way the buildings are organized, they are splitting images of each other, one against the other, as it had happened in the secretariat buildings. So the buildings that were designed by them in this belt, the Vigyan Bhavan in 62, Krishi Bhavan in 57, Supreme Court in 52, Rail Bhavan in 62, Udyog Bhavan in 57, all of them following the same architectural form that was evident in the Delhi design by Lutyens and Baker. They also use chhajjas and chhatris and domes. We see that here, for example, in the dome of the Supreme Court, in the dome of this public building. We see that in the chhatris here, and so we can recollect that in the Secretariat building all over. But it were still unsuccessful attempts, or unskillful attempts, I am sorry, not unsuccessful but unskillful attempts to capture the essence of Lutyens' work. Why do we say that? They do exist. The reason why they did not come out as skilled as it had been done by Lutyens and Baker were CPWD's skills and financial resources were considerably more limited than that of the British architects, and the brick and stucco finish or plaster finish could not produce the same quality as stone had provided. For example, if we compare the Rashtrapati Bhavan with the Supreme Court, the kind of elegance, let us take the example of the chhatris. The chhatris that are used in the Supreme Court are 15 by 15 inch columnar supports, in contrast to those used in Lutyens' Delhi. These are traditional chhatris being taken from Fatehpur Sikri and incorporated in the Central Secretariat building. Of course, it is also a mix. It is a mix of neoclassical planning with traditional Indian architectural features, but it was fairly pure. So there is a greater elegance in form. If, for example, we take the dome of the Sanchi Stupa, as I have already mentioned earlier, and we saw its implementation in the dome of the Rashtrapati Bhavan. If we have the chhatris here totally integrated with the dome, now the concept is same. If you look at this dome with the chhatris on all four sides, or the one in Central Secretariat or the one in the Supreme Court, the concept is the same, but the way they have been brought out seems to be much more, or rather more elegant in the buildings done earlier in Delhi, whereas here that same elegance does not come out. Of course, we are moving away from neoclassicism, we were moving away from totally traditional Indian elements, we were adapting them to a modern time. So there was still a gap left in the way the building came out in front of us. So the design basis in many of the CPWD buildings was elements of traditional Indian architecture to give it an Indian character, combined with modernist form and spatial organization. Now this is very parallel to what the British had done in their colonial buildings. They had taken elements of Indian architecture to give the buildings an Indian character. We see that in the buildings of New Delhi, and the overall layout was a Western layout, or a Western spatial organization. So it is evident in all these buildings of CPWD. So in the end, if we were to draw a comparison between three that we have seen till now, Indo-Saracenic is an amalgamation or fusion of neoclassical or neo-Gothic with traditional Indian architecture, architectural elements, but the fusion is such that it becomes a totally new entity, and but there is modern space planning. Colonial is neoclassical with traditional Indian architecture elements, but it is not a fusion. The elements can be identified separately. You can see very clearly the overall building form layout is Western, the building predominantly is neoclassical, but it has certain traditional elements in it. Whereas in CPWD, the neoclassical part has been replaced with modernism. So it is modernism merged with or added to it is traditional Indian architectural elements, and the spatial planning is modernist. So in all three, the spatial organization is, the space planning is modern or modernist space planning, but its amalgamation Indo-Saracenic, it is colonial, it is neoclassical with elements, and it's modernist with traditional elements in case of CPWD. So these three pictures emerge in front of us, but one question continues to bother us, and that is it basically all about window dressing? That the buildings at their heart are pretty much the same, but the way the building appears on the outside is based on the kind of aesthetic the building has been given. When I began this series, I began by telling you that we would like to see a good building, rather a good building is a combination of three things: form, structure and function. Function is pretty much very similar, only the form on the outside is changing. So is it all there is to architecture? It is only the window dressing that is how we would define modern Indian architecture or modern architecture anywhere in the world, or architecture at any time. Or is it much deeper than that? That function and structure play a very critical role, and that is very true. The way the form comes out in front of us in modern architecture is a direct derivation of the function and the structure, and we will expand on this idea in the days to come. Right now we are still focusing on the form of the building, but as we move forward into modern Indian architecture, we will see that other things, other elements of structure and function will start playing a critical role in the way the building comes out in front of us. I will stop here for today. Thank you so much for joining. These are a couple of references that you can look up. Thank you.